Hey folks, what's up? Today I'm going to walk you through the principles of really effective agile test automation. It's going to be a process that maybe you haven't seen before because it's not what you might think of as test automation. See, a lot of people, when they think of test automation, they think in terms of you have a manual test case, you write your manual test case, you wait till the feature is finished, and then you go and automate some scripts to automate that manual test case. In Agile, that's too slow. In Agile, you need to be faster. You need to be more efficient. You need to be more effective. You need to be more impactful. And that's what I'm going to show you how to do today. In Agile, the general principle is you don't want to be automating manual test scripts because that happens too late in the process. It's not going to help your team at all. In Agile, what you want to do is automate your requirements, automate your specifications. And to do that, there are a number of skills that are a little bit different, a little bit beyond what you normally see in test automation. So that's what I'm going to show you today. I'm going to walk you through the key steps, the process, the flow that happens in an Agile process when you are using effective Agile test automation. So let's dive right into it. We start with what I like to call the illustrate phase. This is where you get together with product owners, BAs, developers, testers, come together and have a conversation about the requirement. So this typically happens before the sprint starts. When you're getting together, you pick up a user story or pick up a feature and you try and figure out what it is you need to build. In this part of the activity, typically you'll be having structured conversations, and we have a whole lot of facilitation techniques like example mapping and feature mapping, and even just writing tables on a whiteboard, bullet points on a whiteboard is just fine. But what we're doing here is we're having a conversation to try and figure out what the key rules and examples are that we want to implement. We're not worrying about automation, we're not worrying about given, when, then, we're not worrying about any fancy structures or tools. What we're really trying to get to the bottom of is to understand the requirement and to understand what we don't know. And so this is very important, to ask lots of questions. And the dumber the question, the better. You ask stupid questions like, well, what happens if this? What happens if this? Is it possible that this could happen? And that way you really try and get to root out all the edge cases, to flush out the assumptions and get a better understanding of what it is you're trying to build. And then what happens is a subset of those people, usually a developer and a tester, or a tester and a BA, will go away and they'll write up those examples, the key examples and rules, in a form that we can automate. And often we'll use something like Cucumber. We'll use this given, when, then notation. At this stage, we're taking the examples that we got from the illustrate phase and we're turning them into a structured format. Again, we're not automating just yet. Here we are agreeing on the definition of what we need to do in business terms. Again, this happens before any development starts. We're setting the goalposts. We're setting the objectives of the sprint, of the feature, trying to figure out what it is we're trying to build. Then we get to the automate phase, and that's where we can actually write code to build out, to flesh out these executable specifications and turn them into an automatable form, turn them into automated tests. Now, in practice, does this happen before the development, or does this happen at the same time as the next phase, which is the create phase, where we actually build the software, or does it happen slightly after? It depends on the requirement, depends on the nature of the feature. Sometimes you can do a lot up front, sometimes you can do it all up front. Sometimes you actually don't need any automation at all because the requirement flows directly into your existing automation support. Sometimes you need to do it all. That's not the important thing. The important thing is that you are trying to do as much automation initially, and to think about the automation initially, think about how you can automate it, think about the best way you can demonstrate that a feature works. what is the best way that you can demonstrate that this requirement actually functions? Is it through a UI test? Is it with the API? Is it a mixture of both? How do you show that this actually works? Because when you can demonstrate it, you've created your software in the create phase or the feature. The demonstrate phase is where you basically run your tests on your CI server and you generate your acceptor, your living documentation, your reports to prove that what you defined in the Formulate phase has been effectively delivered. And that proves that we've actually built the software that we promised. And then we can go back to the illustrate phase if we need to, or we can just pick up another example and continue on with the formulate, automate, continue on with the cycle. So that in a nutshell is the BDD flow. And what I want to show you in the following modules is some real examples of how you actually implement this, of just some concrete cases. We'll walk through an application and we'll see what this looks like in the real world. Because if you can nail this, if you can understand this process, if you can implement this process, it will put you in the top 5% of test automation engineers out there. It will give your team huge leverage. These are skills that not a lot of people, to be honest, have. Not a lot of people master. It is not an easy thing to master, but if you can do it, it takes you beyond test automation. It takes you into the space of helping teams deliver faster, helping teams deliver better, helping teams improve their quality. It's left shifting like you mean it, if you like. So let's dive into it and see what happens when we take a real example. Let's look at our example. The example I want to play with today is a simple frequent flyer application. I'm sure you're familiar with how a frequent flyer application works. You sign up, you fly with an airline, you get points. As you get more and more points, you go up the status levels of your frequent flyer program. So you start with standard, then you go to bronze, silver, gold, and at each level you get benefits. For example, as you go up the levels, you earn points faster. That's what we're going to be experimenting with. So what we do with a user requirement, typically when we start a BDD journey, is we have this conversation, and then we can use, there are a whole lot of techniques that we can use, like example mapping and feature mapping and spec by example. There's lots of ways we can do that. In our live training courses, we spend a lot of time working on how to go through these requirements and how to analyze them, how to understand them, how to have the right conversations. And we're just seeing a little glimpse of what happens here. So what we do typically is when we have a high level requirement like this one, this could be an epic. This is not a user story. It's probably much bigger than that. There's a lot of depth in here. But still, we start with an example. Tell me a story. Tell me how this plays out. Give me a concrete example of what this would look like. And so that's what we call what I call a narrative. And let's have a look at, in this case, what could it be? Well, we have a user, Tracy. She's a traveler. She's a new frequent flyer member. What she does is she travels a few times, takes a few trips, earns some points, gets to bronze, and then in her next flight, she ends up earning more points because she's at bronze. Now, without stepping ahead of ourselves, what we're going to get to with this really high-level example is we're going to get to what we call a journey scenario. And journey scenarios are our end-to-end flows. We don't want too many of them because they tend to be slow and a little bit clunky, but they are really good at telling the whole story where you start from the beginning and go right through to the end. So they're really cool for that. So here's our end-to-end scenario. We'll get to that eventually. But before we do, we want to drill down into these requirements. There's a lot more than just this example. There's a lot of subtlety. There's a lot of detail. There's a lot of edge cases we need to look at. And that's where we use techniques like example mapping and feature mapping and so forth to drill down into those details. So let's have a look at some of those details and see how we can explore them. So the idea is we want to drill down into the details, the business rules for this feature, this epic. One thing we could use is the idea of personas. Personas are typical users of the application, different types of users. So we might have Tracy, who is a generic traveler who's just joined the program, but we might also have Stan, the standard frequent flyer, and Bronwyn, the bronze member, Sylvia, the silver member, and Goldie, the gold member, who earn different levels of points and so forth. Then what we do is we explore the business rules around each of these requirements. So, for example, what do we know? What do we know about this particular feature of earning points? Well, we know that members need a certain number of points to get to each level. So bronze, they need 1,000 points, silver, and they need 2,000 points, and so forth. We know that the points they earn depends on the distance they travel. But that's a little bit general, so we might want to drill down into that a little bit more in detail and figure out how that works. And we might learn that it's actually done by region. And based on the region, you get more or less points. And here we go from a business rule, which we represent with our blue cards, to an example, which we represent with our green cards. So the business rule is that each city is in one of these regions. We've got Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Americas, and Asia. And then, well, give me an example of that. Well, London is in Europe, Sydney is in ANZ, LA, that's in the Americas, and Seoul is in Asia. So we have some concrete examples of cities in those regions. That's a really simple example just to get the idea going. But we might have then some other rules. We develop that concept. So tell me more about this concept of the points related to the regions. Well, depending on the where you travel to and from, you might earn a different number of points. For example, a single economy flight from Los Angeles to London, that will earn you 125 points. And you can see how this goes. We continue asking examples and counterexamples to try and build up our understanding. So here we could say, well, this rule says that the distance is based on which regions you travel between. But what if you travel in the same region? What happens then? So this might lead to us discovering a new rule that flights within the same region earn a certain number of points. So it's not a fixed number, it depends on the region. For example, a single flight between London and Paris might earn 20 points, but a single flight between Seattle and Washington might earn 35 points, for example. And then we continue on with this exercise, exploring the rules. So we might have other rules around travellers earning more points depending on the cabin. What have we got? We've got the premium or business, they get more points. Then depending on their status, they also get more points. So I've summarized a lot of discussion and a lot of activity. This is normally like a 25 to 45 minute exercise, depending on the complexity of the requirement. You'd have lots of questions, lots of discussion around that. And eventually you will get to an example map, in this case, where we cover the length and breadth of our requirement, where we give you an overview of everything that feature needs to do with concrete examples. If these examples can be demonstrated to work, then we're pretty confident that the feature works. So now we're going to look at the Formulate phase. In the Formulate phase, we take the examples and the rules that we figured out in the Illustrate phase. We work through them and we turn them into a more structured, more rigorous format, notation, that we can then turn into an executable specification. So this is typically where we use Cucumber. Now, the scenarios that we come up with, typically there are two types of scenarios. The first that you can see here is called the journey scenario. It's our high-level flow. It's our end-to-end picture. It's our acceptance criteria at the feature or the epic level. You don't have a lot of these. Have a very, very small number because these tend to be fairly heavyweight. UI tests often going right through the back end, going right through the system. They tend to be quite cumbersome, quite slow to write, and quite slow to run. So you don't want a huge number of them. There are other ways you can be a little bit more clever about hooking up microservices together in a chain, for example, and making the end-to-end test go faster. But in any case, you don't have a huge number of them. They're mainly a couple of key examples of the flow through the application. When we turn these scenarios, these journey scenarios, into cucumber scenarios, we might get something like this, like the one you can see here. You can see it's quite large. We only actually have 4 steps, but each step contains a fair bit of data. There's quite a lot going on. In the first step, we say, given Tracy is logged on as a frequent flyer application as a new member, that means behind the scenes we actually create an account for Tracy. When she books the following flights, we actually go through the booking process 3 or 2 times, because once there's a return trip, 2 return trips and 1 single trip, so 3 times we book flights, and then we go to the account page and check her history. So this is a full end-to-end flow. It illustrates the behavior of the user. We're probably not going to do many shortcuts. We want to show the product owner, show the customer what they are getting with this feature. So we really document the end-to-end process in a fair bit of detail. So the journey scenarios are our end-to-end flow. They illustrate the acceptance criteria at the epic or the feature level. We have just a handful of these. The other type of scenarios we have, the vast majority, like 95% of our scenarios, are what we call business rule scenarios. These illustrate specific business rules or specific variations along the way. So if you imagine your end-to-end flow going right from the start to the end, at each point we have little areas where we need to drill in and explore the business requirements, like this one, where we're exploring the ranges of points that happen that lead to different status levels. And this would be an interesting test, because we're actually testing ranges of values. So within the second and third step, the when and the then, what we're going to be doing is checking several data points, or we'll probably use soft assertions or a technique like that, so that we've actually got multiple checks here. And we might have other scenarios like a business rule where we say flights within the same region, will they earn a certain amount of points? And so here we could have several examples, an example for London, example for America, and so forth. And so our given when then scenario would be, again, we could use an example table for this, a scenario outline where we look at each region, an example of a flight in each region, and document the number of points that you earn for the flight in that region. So you only need 1 flight per region. That's absolutely fine, but you need a flight per region. You need to represent all of the regions so that you document your business requirement completely. So these scenarios, these are lighter, faster. We could be using API testing for a lot of these. They are very quick to run. They are quick to write. They are easy to automate upfront and initially before you do any work. So these are very good to when you're doing a test-driven or an ATDD approach and starting your automation right at the start. Right, let's have a look at the automation. This is the fun bit. Here we have our gherkin scenario that we saw earlier. Flights within the same region earn a fixed number of points based on the region. How do we decline that in a given when then format? Well, given Trevor is a new frequent flyer member, when he has completed the following flight, then his point balance should be points earned. And what are those flights? Well, we have a flight from London to Paris, from Sydney to Wellington, from Los Angeles to New York, and from Hong Kong to Seoul. And each of those earn a different number of points. So let's step through the code to see how this works. The important thing here to remember when you're looking at this code is that we are really focusing on the business. We're really focusing on the business rules and the business logic. We're not talking about screens or user interfaces or anything like that. These steps could be done via a user interface or a UI test, or via an API test, or depending on the combination, it could be both. So we have that flexibility, and that is very, very intentional. We need this flexibility because this level, we're describing the business rules. Underneath, we'll describe the implementation. So, for example, given Trevor is a new frequent flyer member, what does that actually involve? Well, here's the code. We have a traveler who attempts to register as a new frequent flyer member, but he does so via the API. So we actually have an API where we implement where we allow travelers to register. So we create a new traveler with some member details from a particular set of test data that we have. So without going into too much detail, because this is basically part of a fairly long training program that I run with my sort of corporate clients and with the individual training programs that I do, and it stretches out quite a while. So there is quite a lot of material here. But generally speaking, what we're doing here is we have a traveler persona. The traveler persona, that's a set of test data that we have defined in some configuration files. Let me find the configuration files here. So we have Tracy, we have Trevor, we have different users of the system with different configuration by default. And then what happens is back in our code, when we define our traveler, we define a traveler with a name, but we give this traveler a unique email address so that we know they'll be unique in the application. That's just some details of our test setup. But the point here is that we're creating a new frequent flyer via the API. That's the interesting bit. Next, when he has completed the flight. Now, before I go in, is this a UI test or an API test? Just pause the video and think a little bit about the answer. So what this actually is, it's an API test. I have a flights API object, which gives me a book flight method where I can create a flight for a particular traveler based on the flights that I pass in from Cucumber. And the flights, what are we doing there? That is very simply a Java 15 record where we have a from, a to, a travel class, and a travel date. So we are literally just setting up the flight for this particular user via the API. And then what are we doing? Points balance should be points earned. We use another API, the user API, to find users by API, and then we check the balance of the user via the API. Now, this is what I call not testing the API, but testing through the API. We are testing business functionality via the API, which makes these tests very, very fast. You're probably wondering about the UI tests. How do we test the UI? When do we test the UI? Why can we just do everything via the API, or do we need some UI tests? So of course, you do need some user interface tests. And here's an example. We have an example where we're checking that should you book a return flight, then it will be counted as 2 single flights. So we're doing that using the UI. It's just an example. We could have probably done this with an API, but we're a little bit more confident because it does involve checking a UI option that we are choosing a return flight and then making sure that that is correctly attributed. So when we look at the details, when Stan books a return economy flight, how does that work? Well, Stan searches for flights from our departure city to our destination in a particular travel class with a return journey of return journey. So we can say true or false, this is a return journey. Then once he searched for them, he books the first flight that he finds, and we have to acknowledge that the booking was successful. So how does that work under the hood? If we just take one random step, search flights, how does that work? We navigate to the book flight screen. We type the destination, the departure into the search fields. We pick the travel class from a drop-down. We check the return journey, and if the return journey is true, then we set a return date. We click on the search button. We wait till the results are visible. Now you can see all of this. This is UI interaction. These are UI tests. This is how we do the UI tests. What we can see here is the from actually maps to a hash departure locator strategy. To would be hash arrival, and so forth. So we're basically interacting step by step with the user interface within the steps. But from the point of view of the step definition, you can see it stays very, very readable. We're still very focused on the interactions from a business, the task from a business perspective. So again, there is a lot of code here. I won't go into too much detail because it would take much more time than we have. But this is just to give you a little idea of what the code looks like. And you can code this other ways as well. There's lots of ways of coding this automation. But the point is we are layering the code so that we are making a clean separation between the business tasks and the actual interactions, whether they be UI interactions or API interactions. The final step is when we run the tests and when we demonstrate the outcomes. So I'm doing this using Maven in this case. Now this will run the complete test suite. So normally you might run it locally, but you would also run it on your CI server. For this particular project, we have it set up on GitHub with GitHub Actions so that it runs the tests, produces the reports, generates the reports for different browsers, and publishes the results on GitHub pages. Now, obviously, your particular environment, you'll have different things that you'll need to do depending on where you're building and where you're deploying to. And this is what an example of living documentation looks like once it's been produced. You do get test results. That's kind of the starting point. But what's really interesting is the living documentation from the point of view of the requirements. Here, for example, we have a hierarchy of our requirements, and we can drill into them and look at all the details. We can look at basically how the requirements that we talked about in those early sessions have been rendered, have been delivered, and have turned into what we call living documentation. If we take our journey scenario, we can see that one up here, where Tracy goes from standard to bronze after she makes several trips. So we can see this has a green tick. That means it works. Awesome. We can go into the details of that and see what it actually did. So here we can see, well, when she books the following flights, what does that involve? Well, it means she does a number of steps. She opens up the search page, she enters some search details, she gets some search results, she clicks on the results she's interested in, she makes some bookings and so forth. And eventually she gets to the point where she can look at her booking page, and we can see again, I'm not sure what you can see there on the screen, it might be a bit small, but let's go into it. We can click in and see the results that she can actually see the pages that have been booked. So we have really tangible, concrete evidence of the outcomes of these scenarios mapping directly back to the requirement that we're trying to implement. So this original requirement where we were talking about the given when then scenarios in business readable languages, that maps directly to our living documentation. So that's what I mean by living documentation. It gives us a representation of what a feature does and how it's been implemented. So both the what and the how. But the how is updated automatically. The how just is how the test plays out. It gets documented, but we don't need to record it in test scripts or anything like that. It's just part of the automation process. What we're really interested in is documenting the business flow, documenting the business rules. If any of these thresholds change, for example, we need to update our scenarios. But if the implementation changed, then no, we wouldn't. These would stay relatively stable. So that's, in a nutshell, what we mean by living documentation. Well done. You've got to the end of this video on agile test automation practices, on what I see are the most effective ways to implement test automation in an agile context. So that's really awesome that you've got through it all. And I hope you've got a lot of value out of it. I hope you've seen just a little bit of the power that goes into this approach. Even if you're not doing BDD as a process, if you're not doing the collaboration, even if you're just doing traditional automation, you can still get a huge amount of value out of this. Because if you take your traditional automation approaches, but you apply these methods, you apply this process, this way of thinking, it just increases the leverage you have. It increases the quality of your automation. It's like I had one of my students, Pankaj, he was working with a very traditional test automation framework using Cucumber and Selenium. And using these techniques, he was able to reduce the time it took to write new scenarios by 80 to 90%. So knowing these practices, putting these practices into place, putting these techniques into your automation really does give you a competitive edge. Even in the job market, it's really powerful. It's like Chrissy, one of our students, who after 4 months on our Serenity Dojo program where we teach all of this stuff, she was able to nail a really high, really well-paid, high position as a senior test automation engineer. She really nailed it. That was awesome. And because it's my personal aim to take testers and put them in the top 5% of test automation engineers. That might be a little bit ambitious, but it is what I personally try to do. So if you'd like some tailored help, if you think you could do with some help getting you to your test automation goals, if you'd like to be part of that 5%, reach out to me personally. We can chat. I do run this program called the Serenity Dojo, which is designed to take testers to that level. It's not for everyone. There is a selection process, but if you are really motivated, if you think this is for you, if you want to get there, reach out to me. We can have a chat.